The first time I got the feeling something wasn't right between my wife and me, I brushed it off as just one of those things that happen in long marriages. Everyone has rough patches, right? But as days turned into weeks, I couldn't shake the nagging sensation in my gut. Every once in a while, I'd catch her looking at me, but her gaze seemed far away, as if she were looking through me rather than at me. One night, while lying in bed, I mustered the courage to ask her directly, "Is something going on?" She looked at me, a flash of guilt crossing her eyes before she laughed it off. "What do you mean?" she replied, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear with that practiced innocence. That single look got me wondering. Instead of doubting her, though, I turned inward, wondering if I had somehow failed as a husband. I even thought maybe I was the problem, maybe I wasn't trying hard enough. That night, I couldn't sleep, going over all the little things I might have done wrong, things I could have improved on to be the man she needed. A few days later, as if on cue, she brought up an idea that almost sounded too convenient. She said she needed a break, a solo trip to Europe. It would be good for us, for me, to just get away and have some space, she explained with a slight grin. I raised an eyebrow but didn't argue, knowing she probably needed time to think things over. As the days ticked by, I found myself drawn to the idea of taking a trip, too. But rather than Europe, I suggested we go somewhere else entirely, a place with a mix of adventure and relaxation. I'd always wanted to visit Egypt. The history, the desert, the allure of something ancient. I could already picture the dusty pyramids under a blazing sun, the feeling of stepping back in time. She was surprised by the suggestion, to say the least. She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought she'd shoot down the idea entirely. But after a pause, she agreed, though her tone was lackluster. I wasn't sure if she was excited about the idea or if she had something else in mind, but her words confirmed her willingness to go. Looking back, I could sense that she might have hoped this trip would rekindle something in our marriage. A spark, a romance that had dulled over the years. But I didn't have the same dreams or illusions. Instead, I was more interested in taking this opportunity to find myself again. Perhaps rediscover who I was before the weight of routine had begun to settle heavily on my shoulders. As I packed our bags for Egypt, I felt a strange thrill, a mix of anticipation and wariness. What would we find there? Or, more truthfully, what would we find within ourselves? Little did I know that my wife and I were about to embark on a journey that would test the limits of love, trust, and, ultimately, the strange pull of destiny itself. When we landed in Cairo, the atmosphere was electric, alive with a sense of history that seemed to seep from every stone, every building, and every grain of sand. The city hummed with life, its narrow streets bustling with vendors, tourists, and locals, all moving in a symphony of color and sound. My wife seemed visibly distracted, her gaze wandering as we made our way through the airport. She seemed fascinated by the allure of a different world, the vibrant colors, the spicy scent of street food, and the call to prayer that rang out over the city as we walked out of the terminal. But there was something else there, too, a distance. She was physically present, but her mind was elsewhere, in a far-off place that I couldn't quite reach. It wasn't long before we met our guide, a middle-aged man named Amir with a broad, friendly smile and a knack for putting tourists at ease. He greeted us warmly, speaking in rapid English peppered with Egyptian slang. He had arranged a small van to take us to our hotel, an old, elegant building in the heart of Cairo that had seen centuries of change. As we climbed into the van, Amir turned to me and said, "You're here at a good time. Cairo is beautiful this season, full of life." He looked at my wife, his smile widening. "And romance." The word romance made her cheeks flush, and she looked away, pretending to admire the cityscape that rolled by as we drove to the hotel. Amir chatted happily, telling us about the local customs, famous sights, and the hidden treasures of Cairo that tourists often missed. His enthusiasm was contagious, and for a moment, I felt a spark of excitement myself. Here we were, in a land of pharaohs and ancient mysteries. Felt like anything was possible. The hotel was a grand, old building with arched doorways, intricate mosaic tiles, and a lobby that smelled of jasmine and incense. As we entered, I felt the weight of history pressing down around us. There was something in the air that whispered of secrets, of stories long forgotten. We were greeted by the staff and given a traditional drink made of hibiscus. My wife sipped it absently, her gaze still distant. That evening, as we unpacked in our room, I tried to bridge the gap that had grown between us. I suggested we take a walk by the Nile, perhaps grab dinner at a local restaurant Amir had recommended. But she was tired, she said, and wanted to rest. The jet lag, the change of scenery, it had all taken a toll on her, or so she claimed. Part of me wondered if there was more to it. Was she already regretting coming to Egypt? Was she wishing she'd insisted on that solo trip to Europe instead? In a way, it felt like we were both carrying unspoken burdens. Mine was a mixture of frustration and sadness at the cracks appearing in our relationship. Hers, I couldn't quite pinpoint, but it was clear there was something else there. A longing, perhaps, or an unfulfilled dream that this trip wouldn't solve. As she settled into bed, I found myself wandering down to the hotel lobby. I was in a strange place emotionally, torn between the hope of mending things and the resignation that maybe our marriage was on its last legs. Downstairs, I noticed Amir sitting in the lounge, sipping a cup of tea. He noticed me, too, and waved me over. We talked for a while about Cairo, the magic of Egypt, and the power of ancient places to stir the heart. At one point, he looked at me intently and asked, "What brings you to Egypt, my friend?" There was a depth in his eyes, a knowing look that seemed to see through me. For a second, I didn't know what to say. Should I tell him the truth? That my wife and I were on the edge, that we were here to try and salvage something that might already be broken? Instead, I shrugged and replied, "A new adventure, maybe a new beginning." It was the best I could manage. Amir nodded thoughtfully, his expression shifting to something almost solemn. "Egypt is a place of transformation," he said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "People come here and find things they didn't expect. Sometimes they even leave things behind that no longer serve them." His words lingered with me as I made my way back to our room. I found my wife asleep, curled up on one side of the bed, looking peaceful for the first time in days. I wondered what secrets she held, what she was searching for in her own heart. And as I lay down beside her, I couldn't shake Amir's words from my mind. Egypt was a place of transformation. The next morning, we awoke to the first light breaking over Cairo. The sounds of the city had already begun to stir. A gentle hum of voices, distant music, and the steady rhythm of life starting anew. My wife seemed a bit more present than the day before, as if the night's rest had cleared some of her hidden tensions. I decided to make the most of it and suggested we start our adventure with a trip to the pyramids of Giza. She nodded in agreement, but there was still that faint shadow of something else in her expression. Our guide, Amir, was waiting for us in the lobby, ready with his infectious enthusiasm and vast knowledge of Egypt's history. As we rode out to Giza, he pointed out historical landmarks, sharing tales of ancient pharaohs, and I could see my wife listening, her interest flickering in and out. But soon, her attention drifted once more, and her gaze was back on the passing scenery, a dreamy look in her eyes. By the time we arrived at the pyramids, she seemed more engaged, but it wasn't with me. It was with the place itself. As we stepped onto the desert sand, she moved ahead, her eyes locked on the massive, timeless structures towering above us. It was as if she was searching for something in the stones, a mystery hidden beneath the ancient carvings. I followed behind, feeling the sting of her distance more sharply with every step. Amir led us on a winding path around the Great Pyramid, sharing stories of Egyptian gods and the myths of the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians believed the soul had multiple parts, he explained, looking at us both with that intense gaze of his. The Ka, the vital essence, and the Ba, the personality. When a person died, these parts could wander, but they always sought reunion. He looked at me pointedly, as if he understood something I hadn't yet spoken aloud. In Egypt, some say that souls find their true paths. Something in his words struck a nerve. Was that why my wife had come here? Was she searching for her own true path, apart from the life we'd built together? I couldn't shake the thought, and as we continued to explore the area, I kept my eyes on her, looking for signs of her drifting mind. The climax of our visit came when Amir offered us the chance to go inside the pyramid's inner chamber, a rare treat that felt both daunting and thrilling. My wife hesitated, but I insisted we try it. It was an experience few people would ever have. Together, we stepped into the narrow passageway, descending into the dim, cool silence of the chamber. The air was thick and ancient, filled with the weight of history, and our footsteps echoed as we went deeper. Once inside, a strange quiet settled over us. It was just the two of us and the surrounding stone, sealing us into an intimacy that felt both comforting and uncomfortable. I glanced at my wife, hoping to catch her looking back, hoping for some spark of connection in this silent, sacred space. But her eyes remained fixed on the walls, as if she were searching for answers there instead of in me. "Is this what you wanted?" I asked her softly, my voice almost swallowed by the chamber's stillness. "To come here and feel something?" She turned to me, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she replied. "I just feel drawn here, like there's something I need to understand." The ambiguity of her response felt like a door closing. I tried to hold on to patience, to remind myself that maybe this journey was a process. Maybe she just needed time. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that she was slipping away, that her heart was reaching for something beyond my grasp. That night, back at the hotel, the distance between us felt insurmountable. She lay beside me, silent and lost in her own world, while I wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. What was she looking for? And was it something I couldn't give her? I even found myself wondering, in a dark, ironic twist, if perhaps we'd been drawn to Egypt to realize just how far apart we'd grown. The next day, we planned to visit the Nile, to take a river cruise and see the sights by water. I hoped the calm of the river might create an atmosphere for us to reconnect. But as I watched her that morning, I couldn't help but feel like I was only delaying the inevitable, that our time was ticking down like sand in an hourglass. As the day unfolded, I held on to the hope that the magic of the Nile might bring us back together, even if just for a moment. Our cruise boat was elegant, with wooden accents and open-air decks that offered a breathtaking view of the river winding through Cairo. The sky was clear, the water glistening as the sun's rays danced on its surface. It was picturesque, the kind of scene that might have felt romantic in a different time, a different life. But as we boarded, I could already sense that she wasn't fully here with me. Her gaze drifted to the other couples on the boat, laughing and holding hands. She looked at them with a longing that was too obvious to ignore. It was as if she yearned for something she didn't believe I could give her anymore. I felt my patience thinning, a subtle anger bubbling beneath the surface. As the boat set off, the gentle sway of the river lulled us into a kind of calm, and for a while we simply sat in silence, watching the Nile stretch out before us. Every so often, I'd catch her stealing glances at one of the other passengers, a tall, striking man who seemed to notice her in return. He was sitting alone, reading a book, but his attention was clearly divided. Each time he caught her eye, he gave a subtle, almost flirtatious smile. I clenched my jaw, torn between confronting her and letting it go. Maybe I was overreacting, reading too much into it. Maybe this trip was just bringing out the worst of my insecurities. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just idle glances. The tension was growing too thick to ignore, so I decided to break the silence. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I asked, gesturing to the river around us, trying to bring her attention back to me. She nodded absently, her mind clearly elsewhere. "Yes, it's breathtaking." But even as she spoke, her gaze drifted back to the man, a flicker of interest that stung more than I cared to admit. At that moment, Amir approached us, bringing a tray of drinks. His timing, as always, was impeccable. "A toast to love and adventure?" he offered, holding up a glass. I raised my glass half-heartedly, my mind still on the man who seemed to have captured my wife's attention. Amir's eyes flicked between us, his expression thoughtful. After a long pause, he leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You know," he said with a hint of mystery, "the Nile is a river of stories. Lovers have come here for centuries, seeking connection, rekindling lost passions. His words hit a nerve, and I glanced at my wife, who looked away, avoiding my gaze. "Some come here to find love," he continued, "and others to leave something behind." A chill ran through me, and I wondered if Amir had noticed the distance between us. It was strange. His words seemed too perfectly timed, too precise, as if he somehow understood the turmoil simmering beneath the surface. My wife, meanwhile, looked almost guilty, as though his words struck a chord within her, too. The rest of the cruise passed in a blur. We floated down the Nile, passing ancient temples and statues that loomed in the distance, relics of a time when love and loyalty held entirely different meanings. My wife's attention remained divided, and the man from before cast the occasional glance our way. I could feel my frustration hardening into something more pointed, a sense of betrayal that I didn't know how to confront. By the time we disembarked, I had a plan forming in my mind, a half-baked, absurd idea that made me feel both bold and reckless. I couldn't keep her attention, it seemed, but maybe Egypt had a lesson for both of us. If she was so enchanted by this place, then perhaps I could show her a side of Egypt she'd never forget. Later that evening, as we returned to our hotel, I pulled Amir aside. I told him I needed his help, that I had a unique surprise planned for my wife. He raised an eyebrow, intrigued, but didn't press for details. "Whatever you need, my friend," he said with a knowing smile. And so, with Amir's assistance, I set the wheels in motion. Egypt had ancient traditions, a different understanding of value and worth. Perhaps, just perhaps, I could remind her of what we'd built together, or show her exactly what she was risking to lose. The plan I had in mind was unconventional, to say the least. As the idea took root, I found myself both excited and uneasy about what I was about to do. But I was done with subtle hints and attempts to reconnect. This trip was supposed to be a wake-up call for both of us, a reminder of the life we'd built together. If it took a touch of drama to make her see things clearly, then so be it. The next morning, I approached Amir with my proposal. I told him I wanted to give my wife an experience that would make her remember what she had, and what she could lose. Amir listened, his eyes twinkling with a mix of curiosity and amusement. He seemed to understand more than I was saying, nodding as I laid out my plan in careful, hesitant words. "So, you wish to give her a true Egyptian adventure?" Amir asked, suppressing a smile. "Exactly," I replied, feeling a surge of determination. "One she'll never forget." Amir thought for a moment, then nodded. "I know just the place. There is a merchant I am acquainted with. A bit eccentric, perhaps, but he'll play along. He has a taste for the dramatic as well." Amir chuckled, clearly enjoying the absurdity of it all. He didn't ask too many questions, which I appreciated. All I needed from him was to set the scene. That afternoon, Amir arranged for us to travel into the outskirts of Cairo, away from the crowded city center, where the desert stretched endlessly beneath the blazing sun. My wife looked puzzled as we left the hotel, but I brushed off her questions with a casual, "You'll see," pretending it was just another excursion. As we ventured farther, the city's familiar sounds and sights faded, replaced by vast stretches of sand and sky. The air was dry and heavy with the scent of dust, and an eerie calm surrounded us. My wife's expression shifted from curiosity to suspicion, her eyes narrowing as if she were beginning to sense the unusual nature of this trip. Finally, we arrived at a small, makeshift tent set up in the middle of the desert. Outside stood an older man with a long, flowing robe and a thick beard. He looked like he'd stepped straight out of an ancient tale, his face lined with years of sun and sand. He greeted us warmly, his eyes glinting with a shrewd intelligence. Amir spoke with him in rapid Arabic, and the man gave a solemn nod. "This," Amir said, turning to us, "is Hakim, a respected merchant in these parts. He deals in goods and in matters of the heart." Amir's eyes sparkled with mischief, and my wife looked at me with a mix of disbelief and growing unease. Hakim gestured for us to sit on a worn rug laid out under the shade of the tent. We settled in, and he poured us each a small cup of mint tea, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he was savoring every second. My wife looked at me, confusion plain on her face. I only smiled, gesturing for her to drink. Hakim began speaking in a low, melodious voice, with Amir translating by his side. In my time, I have seen many loves. Hakim began, his eyes fixed on my wife. Love is a trade, in some ways, an exchange of one soul for another. And sometimes, when love falters, it is tested. He paused, studying her expression as he let his words sink in. Here, in this land, we honor those who are willing to sacrifice, to prove their worth. My wife shot me a look, bewildered and slightly irritated. What exactly are we doing here? She asked, her voice thin and uncertain. I leaned in, my tone casual but with a hint of gravity. We're here to make a trade, I said softly. An exchange that could remind us of what we've built, or what we're risking to lose. She looked between Hakim, Amir, and me, clearly struggling to understand if this was all some sort of elaborate joke. But as Hakim continued, his words took on a seriousness that was hard to ignore. The great kings and queens of Egypt knew that love was not a thing to be taken lightly, Hakim said, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality. When one wished to prove their loyalty, they offered treasures of the heart, priceless to the giver. Hakim looked at me, his gaze intense. Are you willing, sir, to make an exchange of value? To show her what she truly means to you? I held my wife's gaze unflinching. Yes, I replied, letting the weight of the moment settle. And I hope she is too. My wife's face turned pale as she tried to decipher my intentions, a hint of fear creeping into her eyes. Wait, what is this supposed to mean? She stammered, glancing around as if looking for an escape. Hakim raised a hand, his expression serious. A trade must be made. 10 camels, strong and true, are worth a lifetime's devotion. He gestured to the open desert behind him, where, as if on cue, a small caravan of camels appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes moving slowly against the golden sands. Amir smiled, translating Hakim's words with perfect solemnity. In these lands, 10 camels represent a worthy exchange, a pledge, a commitment, a sacrifice. His eyes flicked over to my wife, who was now staring at the camels in sheer disbelief. This can't be real, she whispered, shaking her head. I leaned closer to her, speaking in a low tone that only she could hear. You wanted an adventure, I murmured. Well, here it is. Think carefully about what you're willing to leave behind. For a long, tense moment, we sat there in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. I could see her thoughts racing, her emotions shifting from anger to fear, then to something else, something that looked strangely like realization. This was her chance to see, to really understand what was at stake. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the desert. The camels were drawing closer, their footsteps soft against the sand as they approached the tent. My wife sat frozen, her eyes darting from Hakim to me, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. She seemed on the verge of laughter, disbelief, and perhaps even anger, but none of those emotions fully took over. Hakim, meanwhile, was the picture of calm, his gaze unyielding as he let the silence linger. He understood, perhaps more than either of us, the power of this moment. Amir looked on with a half-smile, as if he had seen this kind of drama unfold before, although, knowing him, he probably never had. With deliberate slowness, Hakim broke the silence. Love is not a simple matter, he said, his voice rich with gravitas. It requires strength, sacrifice, and sometimes a reminder. He turned to me, his gaze intent. You are willing to trade, yes? I met his eyes, feeling the weight of my own conviction, a determination that had been forged in frustration but now carried a strange sense of purpose. Yes, I replied firmly, glancing over at my wife. I am ready to make the exchange. My wife's eyes widened, a mix of disbelief and offense flashing across her face. You can't be serious, she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. What kind of game are you playing? I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. It's just a demonstration, I replied, but my voice held an edge. I want you to see what loyalty looks like, what it means to value something deeply. Amir translated my words to Hakim, who nodded sagely. The camels had now come to a halt outside the tent, their handlers waiting with patience born of experience. Each camel was adorned with colorful cloth and beads, their eyes placid as they watched the scene unfold. My wife looked at them, then back at me, her expression a mixture of confusion and, dare I say, a trace of fear. Hakim raised his hands, signaling to the handlers. 10 camels, he declared, his tone solemn. A fair trade. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual spectacle of foreigners making deals in the desert. My wife's face flushed as she realized we were now the center of attention. She tried to compose herself, forcing a smile as though to downplay the situation, but I could tell she was unsettled. "What do you hope to gain from this performance?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I looked her squarely in the eyes, my expression hardening. "Perspective," I said. "A reminder of what's at stake. You've been drifting, looking for something you think you're missing. Well, here's your chance. You wanted an experience that would make you feel alive? Then embrace it." Hakim clapped his hands, and the camel handlers moved closer, leading the animals right to the edge of the tent. They stood before us, regal and impassive, as though understanding the gravity of the moment. I could feel the tension crackling in the air, a charged silence that felt more potent than any argument we could have had. My wife shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as though looking for an escape. She opened her mouth to speak, but then seemed to think better of it. Her expression was unreadable now, a strange mixture of resignation and defiance. For a moment, I wondered if she would simply get up and leave, if this would be the breaking point that sent her packing. But instead, she turned back to Hakim, her gaze steady and her tone icy. "What if I refuse?" she asked, directing the question to him as though I weren't even there. Hakim considered her words, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Refusal is always an option," he replied smoothly, his tone both soothing and ominous. "But understand, madam, that life is full of choices, and each choice has its consequences." The weight of his words settled heavily between us. She looked at me, a flash of something, anger, perhaps, crossing her face. "So what now?" she asked, her voice barely concealing her irritation. "Are you actually planning to trade me for these camels?" I shrugged, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Why not? It seems you're already halfway gone anyway." She recoiled as though I'd slapped her, the shock evident in her eyes. But behind that shock, I saw something else, a flicker of realization, maybe even guilt. For a brief moment, she looked vulnerable, as if she understood the depth of what I was trying to say. Hakim seized the moment, his voice a low murmur. In ancient times, such exchanges were a way to honor the bond between man and woman, he said. It was a way to remember what was precious, a way to decide once and for all what truly matters. My wife let out a small, bitter laugh, her gaze darting between Hakim, the camels, and me. "So, you think a few animals will make me realize what I have? You think this little scene will change anything?" I looked at her, my expression serious. "Maybe it will," I replied quietly. "Or maybe it won't. But I'm tired of pretending that everything's fine. I wanted to remind you of what we've built, of the life we're throwing away bit by bit. If it takes this to get your attention, so be it." The sun was now dipping below the horizon, casting the desert in hues of red and gold. The crowd had grown, murmurs rippling through them as they watched, entranced by the unusual spectacle. My wife glanced at them, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She took a deep breath, looking as if she were about to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Hakim's gaze softened, his eyes filled with a wisdom that seemed almost supernatural. "Sometimes, one must lose to truly understand what they have," he said, his tone gentle yet firm. "Are you willing to take that risk, madam?" For the first time, I saw her hesitate. She looked at Hakim, at the camels, and finally, at me, her expression conflicted. The arrogance, the defiance. It all seemed to melt away, replaced by something raw and unguarded. She was on the precipice, caught between pride and understanding, and I could only hope that she would see what was at stake. In the silence that followed, I could feel the tension break, a shift in the air that was almost tangible. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to steady herself, then opened them again, looking directly at me. "Fine," she whispered, barely audible, but her voice carried a hint of something that hadn't been there before. "If this is what you need to make your point, then I'll listen." And for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. As we sat under the fading light of the desert, the surreal nature of the situation seemed to settle in. My wife's face softened as she absorbed what had just happened. I could see a shift in her, a glimmer of something that I hadn't seen in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to understand what I had been trying to say all along. Amir, sensing the tension beginning to dissolve, motioned to Hakim. He whispered something in Arabic, and Hakim nodded, then clapped his hands. The camel handlers took a few steps back, allowing us some privacy. Hakim leaned back, folding his hands in his lap, watching us with the calm patience of someone who had seen countless couples on the verge of realization or collapse. My wife cleared her throat, her voice tentative as she finally addressed me directly. "I still don't fully understand what you hope to achieve with all of this," she began, gesturing to the camels and the gathering crowd. "But I can see that you meant it, that this wasn't just some silly prank." I nodded, my gaze steady. "I needed you to see how serious this was for me, to understand that what we have isn't something I'm willing to let slip away without a fight." She sighed, looking down at her hands. "But why like this? Why go to such extremes? Couldn't we have just talked?" The question stung, but I knew it was coming. We had tried talking countless times, and each conversation had ended with her dismissing my concerns, brushing them off as if they were trivial. This wasn't just about words anymore. It was about action, about making her feel the weight of what was at stake. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully, because talking wasn't enough, and I needed you to see that our life together isn't something that can be taken for granted. You seemed to be slipping away, searching for something I couldn't give, and I wanted to remind you of everything we built. She looked away, her shoulders slumping slightly. I could tell my words had hit their mark. The tension in her face softened, and for the first time in ages, she looked vulnerable. Hakim, sensing the moment, broke the silence. "The desert holds many truths," he intoned, his voice low and steady. "It can show you what you're running from, and it can show you what you're willing to fight for." My wife turned to him, something in her expression shifting. She seemed to be grappling with his words, as if they resonated with something deep inside her. For a moment, it felt like the walls she'd built up were beginning to crumble, exposing a glimpse of the woman I had fallen in love with. After a long silence, she turned back to me, her eyes glistening. Maybe I have been looking for something that I thought was missing," she admitted quietly. "But I didn't realize how much it was hurting you. I just felt lost." Hearing her finally acknowledge her own struggle was both a relief and a revelation. I reached out, taking her hand in mine. "Then let's find our way back together," I said softly. "We don't need grand gestures or adventures in foreign lands. We just need each other." For a moment, everything felt suspended. The desert, the camels, even the onlookers, it all faded into the background. It was just the two of us, connected in a way that felt real, raw, and honest. Amir cleared his throat, breaking the silence gently. "Perhaps we can conclude this evening with a small celebration," he suggested, his tone warm. "Hakim's hospitality knows no bounds, and he would be honored to share a meal with you both." Hakim nodded, smiling broadly. "Yes, yes, please," he agreed, gesturing for us to stay. "Tonight, you are my guests." My wife glanced at me, her expression hesitant but open. I could see she was still processing everything, but the anger and bitterness that had been there earlier seemed to have faded. She nodded, squeezing my hand. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's stay." Hakim instructed the camel handlers to prepare a fire, and soon we were gathered around a small circle, the flames casting flickering shadows across the sand. A humble yet hearty meal was prepared. A simple stew, fresh bread, and dates. We ate in comfortable silence, the warm desert air surrounding us like a gentle embrace. As the night wore on, Hakim shared stories of love and loss, tales passed down through generations that spoke of the desert's wisdom and the resilience of the human spirit. His words were laced with humor, empathy, and a profound understanding of the human heart. I watched my wife as she listened, her expression thoughtful, perhaps even touched by the stories. At one point, she leaned in close to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for this experience," she murmured. "I think I understand now." I didn't respond with words, but I gave her hand a gentle squeeze, letting her know that I appreciated her honesty. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were truly on the same page, that we were beginning to heal the rift that had grown between us. When the meal ended and the fire began to die down, Hakim gave us both a warm, fatherly smile. "Love is a journey," he said, his voice soft. "It is not easy, but it is worth every step. I wish you both happiness and strength." We thanked him, feeling a renewed sense of purpose as we made our way back to the city with Amir. The night was quiet, the stars glistening above us, and for the first time in a long while, we walked side by side, our steps in sync. As we returned to the hotel, a sense of calm washed over me. This journey had taken an unexpected turn, but it had given us exactly what we needed. A reminder of the love we shared and the strength it took to fight for it. In the silence of our hotel room, my wife turned to me, a soft smile playing on her lips. "I guess I should be grateful you didn't actually trade me for those camels," she teased, a hint of her old humor returning. I chuckled, shaking my head. "You're worth far more than 10 camels." For the first time in what felt like forever, we laughed together, a sound that was both familiar and new. And in that moment, I knew we had turned a corner, that we were finally beginning the journey back to each other. Part 8: Rediscovering the Spark. The following days in Egypt were unlike any trip we had taken before. Something about our encounter in the desert had left a mark on us both, breaking through the walls we had built and exposing a rawness neither of us could ignore. My wife's demeanor softened, and for the first time in a long while, she seemed truly present, as though she'd let go of the weight she had been carrying. We wandered through bustling marketplaces, the vibrant sounds and smells surrounding us. She reached for my hand, squeezing it as we walked through narrow alleyways and browsed exotic wares. The familiarity and comfort in that simple gesture reminded me of the early days of our relationship, back when we would stroll hand in hand, exploring the world together without a care. One evening, as the sun set behind the pyramids, casting them in a golden glow, we found ourselves alone, seated on a quiet rooftop overlooking Cairo. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting a mixture of regret and gratitude. "I know I haven't been the easiest person to live with," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "I just got lost somewhere along the way." I nodded, my heart heavy but hopeful. "We both did," I admitted. "But we're here now. Maybe that's all that matters." That night, we talked for hours, sharing our fears, our doubts, and our dreams for the future. I realized that our struggles had been less about each other and more about the ways we had grown without acknowledging it. We were no longer the same people we had been when we first met, and we had been clinging to old versions of ourselves, too afraid to face the changes. By the time dawn broke, we had fallen asleep on the rooftop, her head resting on my shoulder as the first rays of sunlight bathed the city in warmth. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to rebuild our foundation, brick by brick. The next day, we decided to take a day trip to a more secluded area. My wife had heard about a hidden oasis, a place where the desert sands gave way to lush greenery and natural springs. We hired a guide who led us deep into the desert, where the landscape seemed to change with every passing mile. As we reached the oasis, the guide pointed us toward a tranquil spot near the water. My wife seemed enchanted by the scenery, her eyes lighting up as she dipped her feet in the cool water. We sat in comfortable silence, soaking in the serenity. But amid the beauty, I couldn't shake the memory of why we had come to Egypt in the first place. The temptation to test our newfound trust was strong, and part of me wondered if I could have forgiven her if things had taken a different turn. In the quiet of the oasis, I faced my own doubts and insecurities, recognizing that forgiveness wasn't a simple act. It was a choice I would have to make over and over, a commitment as challenging as love itself. My wife seemed to sense my introspection, reaching for my hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the water, "for giving us a second chance." As our trip neared its end, we decided to return to the desert one last time to visit Hakim. He welcomed us with open arms, his wise eyes shining with approval as he saw us approach, hand in hand. Hakim invited us to share tea with him, and as we sipped the fragrant brew, he turned to my wife, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me, madam," he said gently, "what have you learned?" She hesitated, looking at me before answering. "I've learned that love isn't something to be taken for granted. It's something you have to nurture, to protect, even when it feels impossible." Hakim nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "The desert has shown you both what you needed to see," he replied. "And now, you must carry that wisdom with you." As we prepared to leave, Hakim surprised us with a gift, a small vial of desert sand. "To remind you of where you found each other again," he said. "Keep it close, and remember that love, like the desert, is vast and enduring." The flight back home felt different, lighter. We talked about our future with a newfound clarity, discussing plans, dreams, and the simple joys we had taken for granted. The sand Hakim had given us sat in my pocket, a constant reminder of the lessons we had learned. Once we landed, our usual routines resumed, but with a new perspective. The small, mundane annoyances no longer seemed so daunting, and we began to make time for each other in ways we hadn't before. Our relationship, once strained by doubt and resentment, had begun to grow again, strengthened by the trials we had faced together. Trust was not something that would be rebuilt overnight, but with each day, it became easier. We started setting aside time each week to talk openly about our feelings, discussing any issues before they could fester. Our connection deepened, the vulnerability we had shared in the desert serving as a foundation for this new chapter. I found myself growing in ways I hadn't expected, learning to let go of past grievances and focusing on the present. My wife, too, seemed to embrace this growth, meeting me halfway as we both worked toward a common goal, a marriage that could weather any storm. Months passed, and with each one, we rediscovered the simple joys that had once brought us together. We laughed more, shared more, and found comfort in the small moments. We took spontaneous weekend trips, cooked meals together, and even picked up new hobbies, learning to appreciate the value of shared experiences. One evening, as we looked through old photos from our trip to Egypt, my wife turned to me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being there, even when I didn't deserve it." I smiled, pulling her close. "We both deserved this chance," I replied, "and I wouldn't trade it for anything." With each passing day, our relationship grew stronger, the love between us rekindled and redefined. Our experience in Egypt became a turning point, a story we would tell for years to come, each retelling reminding us of the importance of resilience and commitment. We found ourselves in a place of peace, our bond deepened by the trials we had faced. The sand from the desert sat on our mantle, a constant reminder of the journey we had undertaken and the lessons we had learned. Years later, as we sat together, watching the sunset from our porch, I glanced at my wife, marveling at the woman beside me. The journey we had taken, from the brink of separation to the rediscovery of our love, had left us both forever changed. In those quiet moments, I understood that love was not a feeling but a choice, a commitment made every day, in small acts of kindness and patience. We had faced our demons, weathered the storms, and come out the other side, stronger and more united than ever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting our world in a warm glow, my wife reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. In that simple gesture, I felt the weight of our shared journey, the strength of a love that had withstood the test of time. And I knew, without a doubt, that I would choose her again.